When it comes to cloud storage, there are a few things we can define that we can secure in our storage bucket. We can decide who gets to upload files. We can decide who can read those files, like partially. I'll get to that later. We can block certain file types from being stored in the bucket, and we can also create temporal URLs that expire whenever we want. With that in mind, let's begin. We're going to go into our storage console and we're going to look for the rules tab. In here, you're going to see that you have the default security rules. They are open. It says that everything you want to upload, like read or write from the storage bucket, is possible. Since you are paying for everything that gets uploaded to the storage bucket, I believe that there are two restrictions you need to enable right away. First, make sure only authenticated users get to upload files. We can do that replacing the code here with something like this. And this says that everywhere in the bucket, you are going to be allowed to read the files or write to the bucket if you are an authenticated user. That way, you make sure that only users that are authenticated in your application can upload those files. In here, what match all paths mean is that all paths inside the bucket will be covered by this rule. We can do something different like user slash user ID. This means that we're going to have a folder called user because here the path is a folder structure. And inside that, we are going to have multiple other folders and they are going to have the ID of the user that's creating the request. So this user ID is a variable. So user slash 123, user slash 456, they are all going to be covered by this same rule. This is only going to match at that level, so those folders. But if you want the rules to cascade and apply to all of the folders inside of those folders, you can also do here like this and do all path equal star star. And this is a wildcard that's going to say, okay, inside of the folder users, we have a folder called, 123, and everything that is inside 123 is going to be managed by these rules right here. The second thing I believe you need to log right away is to only allow the users to upload a certain size for files. So for example, if I say here that we need authenticated users and that the request.resource.size, so this is the size of the resource is the file, it's going to be less than 124 by 124. This is 1 megabyte. The size is stored in bytes, so it's basically 1024 bytes times 1024 bytes, that's 1 megabyte. Here we can also log for the path using these variables. So for example, let's say that this folder belongs to a specific user and we want to check if the user that's going to read or write from that folder is the owner. We can append a new rule and it's going to be if the request.auth.uid is equal to the user ID, then we are telling it that the same user that's sending the request is the one that owns this folder. So we are going to allow that request to pass. We can also use functions here to make things more readable. So we're going to replace this and this is going to do the same. But you see that here I'm taking the path and it's user ID. And then I'm asking is folder owner and I'm asking restrict file size to 5. So when we look at the functions we have is folder owner takes the user ID and then checks if the authentication is different from null. And if the request.auth.uid is equals to the user's ID, then yes, this is the folder owner. And then I have a function called restrict file size and it takes the size in megabytes. And it takes and it says, okay, is the file's size less than whatever you send here? And if those two match, then it passes the request. If not, it blocks it. Now we can talk about who can read those files and partially. And what do I mean by partially? It's that here is where things get a bit tricky. There is mostly one way to read data from the client. you need to get the file's download URL. To get it, you use the Firebase client of preference. Let's say, for example, here I'm using the Web SDK, so I can create a function like this called getDownloadURL. It's going to get storage from firebase.storage, and then it's going to create a reference to that file that I have on the bucket. So for example, here I'm saying in the users folder, it's user, I'm going to get the folder with the ID of Jorge Vergara, and inside I'm going to get a file that's called profile.png. Then to that reference, I can use the getDownloadURL method, and this will return the profile picture URL, where the profile picture URL is the URL you can use to access or download the file. You can use it directly in the browser, or you can add it as the source property of an image tag, or so on. Now, here's the issue and why I say it's tricky. Getting the download URL is protected. It uses Cloud Firestore security rules. So, if you have permission to this path in the database, then this function will use the security rules and you'll get that file. If you don't have permission, you won't get that file. But once you have the download URL, like once you have the permission and you download the URL, the download URL has the bucket download token in it. So the URL will look something like this, where you have Firebase storage, Google APIs, and you're going to have the path to the file. This includes information about your bucket and things like that. And then you have a token. That token means that whoever has the URL can access the file. The token can be revoked through the Firebase console, but besides that, it's a public token for people to use. So here you mostly have two choices. First, you don't store the download URL anywhere, and every time a user needs it, they can click the button to get it. It uses this download URL function, and it's good because you will get the authentication, you will get all of the rules, all of that by default. Or second, if it's something that's not really that important, you can use the download URL method and you can store that in the database, whatever URL you get in return. And then you make sure that the place you store it can have the same kind of permissions set in Firestore that you use in your storage rules. Also, remember that there are files you want to have public, as in images you're displaying in your app and things like that. So don't block public files from download. Whichever route you take, either using this getDownload URL or storing the URL in the Firestore database, is up to you. I usually prefer the second one, as if I have the download URL stored in Firestore, I can always access it even if offline. And I can cache the image to make sure it works. Okay, now we are going to move to another one of the important things to block, and we need to be able to block file types from being stored in our bucket. One thing you want to make sure is that people aren't using your storage bucket to hold malicious code. For example, what happens if I store a JavaScript file and then send the download link to people? Whenever they click that link, the JS would run inside their browsers. To restrict this, one good idea is to tell your security rules that types of file you are going to allow. For example, if you are only going to allow them to store sales receipts in image and PDF format, you can use the security rules to tell the app to only allow PDF and images. For that, we can use the request variable that we have here that holds the resource that's the actual file, and in there we get the metadata of the file. So for example, if we implement it here, we can change it like this. And notice that we are passing the first two same functions. It says restricted file size is folder owner, and we are checking for those. But we are adding a new check that's called isAllowedFile. And when we check that function, we see, okay, here, if the request.resource.contentTime matches image/JPEG or PNG or WebP or TIFF or application/PDF, then those are allowed. And if it matches one of those, move forward. If it's not, like if it's an HTML, CSS, or an SVG file, a JavaScript file, It will block the request and the person won't be able to store that file inside of your bucket. Another option we have is to create temporal URLs. Those are links that expire after some time. We can set the time from a couple of minutes up to 7 days. This is a server-side operation. Since the token is different, it generates a Google Sign token. For that, we can use Cloud Functions. So we're going to create an HTTP function where you pass the file's path and expiration time, and it returns the temporal URL. So our function will look something like this, and we are initializing the admin application. We are getting file storage, and the payload we are going to send to this function is going to look something like this. We are going to set the file path. This is a string that it's going to say, okay, so here's the path to the file that I want to create the URL for. And this other variable, expiration time in minutes, is going to say, okay, I want this file to expire in 10 minutes, 100 minutes, 20 minutes, and so on. So after this, we are going to get the properties out of the body for our function to be able to work. And we are getting file path from request.body.filepath and expiration time in minutes from request.body.expiration time in minutes. And we are saying if this doesn't come in the request, then default it to 15 minutes. You could also here send a bad request error, but I just think that for the sake of the example, I'm going to set a default. After that, we are going to use the storage SDK to create a signed URL with a custom expiration date. As you can see here, we are saying that, okay, to get the signed URL response, we are getting from storage, we're going to get the bucket, we're going to get the path to this file, and then once we are on the file, we're going to use the getSignedURL method. It takes the action read, write, delete, or resumable. We're going to say a read because this is just a permission to view the file, and we're going to set the expiration time. Here we're saying, okay, this is expiration time in minutes, so we need to multiply it by 60,000 milliseconds. And this is the current date, so right now, plus whatever we send here in minutes. And it will create the signed URL. The response for the signed URL is a string with one value inside. And that value is the asset URL. So that URL you got here, like this is the signed URL you can now send to your users, and your users will be able to use that URL for the amount of time that you set. As soon as that time or that expiration time hits, then the URL will no longer work.